Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Gloff. I'm an independent musician, and I'm the founder of Riotboy Records. I've been releasing music since 1993, and this year was my 50th birthday. In honor of my 50th birthday and 32 years of music, I've decided to archive all of my past releases and re release them with bonus tracks, bonus material, and most importantly, across all digital platforms, there's a lot of inconsistencies in my discography. Things were in the wrong order, the track lists were wrong, and I myself host a podcast where we tackle an artist's discography and talk about it from the first album to the most recent. So, being a music collector and fan, it's so important to me that an artist's work is archived correctly. So, the time had come to do the same thing for my own work. I'm going to talk about my reissue campaign in three different parts. I have 25 solo albums. I have a variety of collaboration albums and EPs, and we're going to go release by release, and I'm going to kind of share with you the goodies that are available on each release. So, the year was 1993. This was my first release, a little album called True Stories. It had 10 songs. I recorded it in my parents' house on a little 4-track recorder. At the time, I was listening to a lot of Sinead O'Connor, and the influence that Sinead had on my music was just to really dig deep and be personal. Uh, I find this unlistenable. I mean, it's really rough. I think a lot of artists would probably pull this off the market and not want people to hear it. But I think it's so important to not be ashamed of the younger versions of ourselves and the less refined versions of ourselves, because everything's a journey and an evolution. So, uh, that I think something of note of this album came out in 1993 is the last line of the last song says, "I wish he was here again," and that was kind of the first time that I ever shared with anybody in my world that I was gay. I was in love with this guy that I went to high school with. There are a lot of songs about him on this album. It was unrequited, but I wasn't able to talk about it with anybody. So that's why this album was called True Stories, I think, is because through these 10 songs, for the first time, I was able to really express myself. Uh, but something that people may not know is that the story actually did not start here. Before True Stories, there was this little 7 song. I don't know if you can see the writing here. The 7 song demo that came out in 1993, earlier in the year than True Stories. Uh, it was something that kind of circulated around the hometown. There were 7 songs on it, as I said, and a few of these songs I actually redid on later albums. Pretend I'm Lightning, the opening track, uh, was redone on my album Heavy Machinery. Another Side to Love, I actually demoed for my Romantico album in 2003. It didn't make that album either, but it finally made my album The Box in 2019. So Another Side to Love went through 3 different incarnations. And then From Your Balcony was re-recorded on my Songs About Stupid People album in 1997. So I've always wondered, like, what to do with this little demo tape. Uh, I mean, if True Stories is rough, this little thing here, I just never knew what to do with it. So in the process of reissuing my catalog, I thought, you know what? I think it's time for this bad boy to come out. So if you go to the True Stories album on any digital platform, there's now a deluxe expanded edition that includes the 7 original demos. So if you really wanted to listen to my life story from the first song all the way through to the most recent, you really have to start with Pretend I'm Lightning on this little demo tape here, because that's where the actual story began. Um, it was interesting to listen back to this and to actually include it in my discography again, because I was just a young kid with a cheap keyboard in a small town, and I was just experimenting and trying to find my voice. So it feels good to have this be part of the world. Well, 1994 came. That was a wild year for me. I got kicked out of my house. I was living on the streets for a while. And over the summer, I was squatting on this skateboard apartment, and I had a Yamaha keyboard. And in between hanging out with all the tough skaters, uh, I didn't have money for food. I used to pick through the garbage cans because you could get 5-cent deposits on cans in Western New York. So I would take the cans back and buy myself lunch. And I did have friends that worked at an all-night donut shop, and a lot of times we just had donuts for dinner. But when my friends weren't around and when I was alone on the couch, I would take those Dunkin' Donuts napkins and write song lyrics and start writing songs. And I did go back to my parents' house for about 2 months in October 94. And that's when I recorded my second album. It's called Still Feel It. Uh, it's very much just a keyboard and voice album. This was 12 songs, and this was my first, what I consider like big release. I had a big show at this coffee shop. I thought I was going to take over the world and be famous. Because all my friends were telling me how great I was, and I felt like I was great. Listening back, you're like, well, maybe not. But this album, True Stories was the first album, but this was like the first I sold this to a lot of people. It kind of locally had some legs, and I remember they sold it in the record store, and that was so cool. But Still Feel It's still such a special album, and it's interesting because on a lot of my old albums, I would kind of redo some of the old songs, but Still Feel It's an album that I always kind of left alone. These songs just all belong with each other. I was working at my first job at Arby's. There's a song about my manager. Uh, there's a song about this girl that was dating the guy I was in love with, and it's so mean. And she found it like years later on MySpace and sent me a message, and I was so embarrassed. But like, I don't think she's ever forgiven me. But hell hath no fury like a scorned gay man. So forgive me, Courtney. Um, Still Feel It. There was one song that was recorded for this album that was not put on it, and it was called Hot Daddy. It was considered years later for another album, but Hot Daddy is available as a bonus track on the digital edition of Still Feel It. Now, in the 2000s, that's when CDs came along, and I did reissue all of my cassette discography on CD. But the thing is, cassettes oftentimes had 90 minutes of content, and you can only put 80 minutes on a CD. So there were some modifications in the track list, and those inconsistencies made their way into the digital because what was released on the CD got transferred to digital. So originally, True Stories and Still Feel It was available as a CD called The First Two Albums. In the process of reissuing my catalog, these albums are once again available as single releases. So True Stories is its own album, Still Feel It's its own album, and then of course they have the bonus tracks. Well, the next release to come out, I partnered with my best friend, Ann Fearman. We became a band called The Basement Lounge, and we had a little cassette called Hot Lunch. And we played the coffee shop circuit in Western New York. We got kicked off the stage many times because we were so outspoken and very raunchy, and I feel like very ahead of the time in our outspokenness. This album, I think, was a local favorite. Hot Lunch, it was called. The album was reissued in the 2000s digitally, but the version was remastered with some reverb on it. So the original dry versions of the song, you had to have the original cassette for most of them. And another thing is, when the album got transferred to digital in the early 2000s, it wasn't connected to my discography. So this album was re-released, so it was connected to Jeremy Gloff and Ann Fearman's digital music platforms. So, this was officially really the third album. Good times. So then, Courtney Love came along. I discovered Courtney Love. Grunge was out. And the biggest takeaway that I felt as an artist is, I was 19, I guess 18, 19, 20. And that Riot Girl music and that grunge is such a cheesy word, but there was such a rawness about it. And you really just I don't want to say you peeled off the Band-Aid, but you peeled off the filter and you just let yourself bleed out. And I think that was really the next solo album, Heavy Machinery, was just a lot heavier. And I remember just wanting people to think that I was outspoken and raw. And here's the CD version of Heavy Machinery. When this was released on CD in the early 2000s, some of the songs from Hot Lunch were put as bonus tracks. And these are the versions that weren't remastered without the reverb. So I did keep those as bonus tracks on Heavy Machinery. Another thing is, on this CD, originally there was an earlier mix of the song November that was different than the cassette version. So in the new remaster, I've restored the original released version of November, but as a bonus track, I kept on that earlier version that was on the Heavy Machinery CD. So both versions of November are there, as well as the Hot Lunch bonus tracks. So Heavy Machinery, a huge release for me at the time. Then I moved to Buffalo, New York, and that was my first time living in a city. I really immersed myself in club culture. It was the early 90s. The rave scene was big. I had pigtails, and I used to walk around the raves with an Easter basket, passing out cereal, playing the tambourine on the box with my CV Nicks, Shawly kind of things. But artistically, I really immersed myself in the Buffalo coffee house culture. It was the mid 90s by this point, 1996. A lot of open mics. Ani DeFranco was huge in Buffalo. I was never an Ani fan, but people called me the male Ani DeFranco, which kind of made me a little bit mad at the time. But didn't stop me from trying to get signed to Righteous Babe Records. And I do have the rejection letter somewhere in my archives. So, Ani, I guess it just wasn't meant to be. But the album that came from this era was called Below the Velvet. And this is an album where I really dealt for the first time with a lot of the bullying that I experienced in high school, being gay in a time when I didn't even know I was gay. And it was very dangerous. I really felt like if people found out I was gay, I would literally get killed. That's how I felt. So, moving to a city and finding a safe space, and my friend Sadie took me to the University of Buffalo Straight Gay Alliance, and I made a lot of really progressive friends. This was such an artistically fertile time. And I also got my little first taste of local celebritydom. I remember playing these songs at the Stimulants coffee shop and seeing everybody singing along, and it did kind of go to my head a little bit. I will say, I thought it was a big deal in Buffalo, New York. But this album sold pretty well, Below the Velvet. Um, when I was remastering this album, on the CD, there was a bonus track from a later album that didn't fit. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I found a 3-song cassette of me doing some of these Below the Velvet songs live in my friend Sadie's living room. So those 3 live tracks are available on the digital version of Below the Velvet. So if you want to hear what Jeremy Gloff sounded like live in 1996, those 3 bonus tracks are on the Below the Velvet digital. I remember there was a lot of fury in my music then. I'd play the guitar so hard that my hands would just be bloody afterwards. And I feel like a lot of that rage I probably still haven't dealt with it to this day. It's probably buried. All right. So, Below the Velvet had done well. I'd established myself in Buffalo as kind of this folky riot boy character. But Lord knows there's nothing I ever hated more than being typecast and put in a box, even if I created that box myself. So my friend Greg sold me his W7 Yamaha synthesizer. It was this huge, really high-tech synth at the time. It had a disk drive, and here they are. Here's my Yamaha W7 discs. They have all the instrumental versions. So I didn't want to repeat myself. I didn't want to make another Riot Boy album. So I started, my friend Sadie, I remember driving with her on the thruway, and she says, in your songs, you're not afraid to talk about, how you got beat up in high school, but she's like, what about your feelings really inside? What about what you're going through with your family? So I started to dig a little bit deeper and a little bit more personally with this next album, and the synthesizer became the backdrop because Lord knows I did not want to be the male Ani DeFranco. So the next album was Midnight Blooming, and this was very much a different album for me. It was pop. There was some hip hop on there. I collaborated with this guy, the Joker, that I worked with at Arby's on some hip hop songs. He passed away, so rest in peace, Evan. And I just remember, when I started going to the clubs in Buffalo, I just felt so filled my cup. But very quickly, it just felt very surface and shallow to me. And I remember going to the club and just being very pensive and just being really in my head. And people like, why don't you smile? Just have a good time. I just never could subscribe to escapist culture. Just even in the height of my club days, I was still in that head. So Midnight Blooming, it was only released a few months after Below the Velvet, and I saw the kind of attention drop off a little bit because these songs are a little bit more introspective. I was wearing a black choir robe and a scarf, and it was very Kate Bush. I was very artistic. Um, so there was a remix I did of the song Midnight Blooming, and I thought it was on one of these discs. And nobody has the W7 synthesizer anymore. And those that do have it, the disk drive doesn't work. So I posted all over message boards, all over the internet to try to find someone to extract these files off these discs for me. And finally, I found someone named Carl Street 3, as well as Ben Poole from overseas, who had a program where they could take these files and get them back into music. So I shipped these discs all over the country to get these songs, and it turns out the Midnight Blooming remix was just lost forever. But there was a song on there called Night Wind that I don't remember at all. I think it was me and Sadie J collaborating on something weird. So that's one of the bonus tracks on Midnight Blooming. There's also the original version of the song Sweet Jane. That was the first song I'd written in Buffalo. I put these lyrics that Sadie had written to music, and that original version did appear on Sadie's album, Just Passing Through Fun, and I've included it on the Midnight Blooming reissue as the Sweet Jane demo. Then the final song on the Midnight Blooming reissue is an instrumental version of Lay Down, which was used in the live release show. And I remember I set up this big box. I was going to walk out, step up on the box, play the tambourine, jump up, and I did that. I stepped on the box, I played the tambourine, I jumped up, and I fell right through the box. Right at the CD release party, the box fell through. But that instrumental of Lay Down that I created for that show, I thought it was cool to add that as a bonus track because that was a moment. It was a moment. All right, late 96, we all decided we were moving to Atlanta. We were too big for Buffalo. It was time to move to Atlanta and really make this thing happen. When I got to Atlanta, uh, all the people, there wasn't a coffee shop full of people that knew my songs anymore. In fact, anytime I did play out in Atlanta, like it was totally a different vibe. Like I felt no love. I didn't feel any love in Atlanta. It was just a whole new city. And I guess I didn't have the roots there. I don't know what it was, but I just got more and more depressed. And I remember feeling suicidal for the first time in my life. And we found this house in this neighborhood where there was like a lot of gunshots. We had a lot of, there was this row of ants through the kitchen, always like one line going this way, the other going this way. And we just had this punk house in this neighborhood in Decatur, Georgia. I was living with a noise band called Another Dead Sharon, and they were working on an album called Paul, which was two 90-minute cassettes. And I feel like some friendly, I don't want to use the word competition because that's negative, but it's good to try to keep up with your artistic friends because sometimes it's a motivating force. So I felt because my friends were spreading their wings so significantly artistically that I wanted to do the same thing myself. So I was just writing all these songs and they made no sense together. And eventually I had like 20 songs. And at the time I was listening to Fleetwood Mac's album Tusk a lot. So using Tusk as a prototype, a bunch of 20 songs that make no sense together, that's how I sequenced my album Songs About Stupid People, which came out November 1st, 1997. And I just remember like mailing free copies of this to people that knew me in Buffalo. And I had like a release show to my four friends in Atlanta. And it was just such a really, I guess, valuable ego check to just realize like, you ain't shit, Jeremy. And I think one time in Buffalo, I'm like, do you know who I am? And that like 30 years later, I still cringe like, oh, how can I do that? How embarrassing. But we're all young and we all learn and grow. But Songs About Stupid People was such an experimental album for me. I was still doing the W7 stuff on the discs. There's some gothic songs, there's some pop songs, there's some acoustic songs. From Your Balcony gets remade from the first demo tape I had. And it's such a bizarre album. And, this was such a long album that when it was reissued on CD, I had to move some of the tracks to bonus tracks and other albums. So, in the process of redoing my catalog, I was able to finally put Songs About Stupid People into its original sequence with its original running order. And I remember I did a reissue even in 1997 with two more bonus tracks. So everything now in the digital version is exactly how it was released. And it's such a weird experimental album. And when I was listening to the cassette to try to make sure I was doing everything right, I found all these interludes that I completely forgot. There's all these like radio voice interludes I don't even remember them at all. But I restored them and now they're back on the album. So Songs About Stupid People on digital is its original running order, complete with all the songs and all the interludes intact. And I remember like artistically, I just felt dead, kind of like I just felt like I hit a brick wall. Wasn't excited about this experimentation. It didn't really feel thrilling or good at the time. I think just because I was so depressed. And then I met a guy named Will at a coffee shop in Atlanta called Dunkin' Dine. He was this little punk kid. He hung out with this homeless guy named Larry. And I used to just spend so many nights at Dunkin' Dine with my friends, especially working on the Songs About Stupid People album. And over a couple of tables would be Will and Holly and Keith and their friends. And, when you're young, the two tables of punks all just became one table and we all became friends. And I just fell so in love with Will. I just thought he was so sweet. He had such a kind heart, and he was showing me so many things. Having come from a, a kind of troubled family and not a happy life in Western New York, to drive around with this kid in his punk rock car with his friend Larry, I just once again felt a light turn on in my life, and I'm getting a little teary eyed talking about it. But I started writing songs on the acoustic guitar for the first time since I was in Buffalo. And they were such different songs. They were songs full of adventure and wanderlust and vagabond and hope. And that began the Jeremy's Wonderland album. And some of the songs were about Will. And I remember sitting in Will's car in some parking lot at 2 in the morning. The Hail Bop comment was in the sky. And I just remember sitting with my guitar, playing Will the songs I'd written about him. And he just sat there crying, and I was crying. And he said, play them all again. So I played them all again. And it was just a beautiful time. Uh, but as quickly as it was great, we started fighting a lot and things got distant and things got weird. And I just continued to get as happy as Will made me with it not working out and kind of bad things happening. I had a friend, Shauna, that was visiting me from Buffalo, and I just gave away most everything I owned to the AmVets thrift store. I jumped in Shauna's car and I just took up the east. I took up off. I took off. I went up the East Coast and I stayed in North Carolina for a little bit. I stayed in Pittsburgh for a little bit. I was in Buffalo. I was just really living that vagabond lifestyle. And I remember getting in Shauna's car and the song Rome was on the radio by the B-52s and the sky was so blue. And I just felt like I'm going to be okay. Um, I lived in Pittsburgh for a little bit. I came 2 days away from signing a lease. That didn't work out. I went back to Atlanta for a little bit to see Will, and to see my friends, and I still was on a lease down there, so I moved back into my bedroom for a month. And then I ended up going back to my hometown and living on Greg Greg's floor on Canada Way Street. And I finished off the Jeremy's Wonderland album on Canada Way Street. And I just remember late night walks with Greg Greg, looking at the stars in the sky and going to Lake Erie with my friends there and just feeling the power of the waves. And it was just such a time in my artistic life and personal life where I felt so sad, but so hopeful and so connected to the universe. And this album, Wonderland, mm, it's just a big one in my heart. Um, when Will died in 2015, it's another story for another album. But some of the words from one of these songs on this album got read at his funeral. So just so meaningful. This album means so much to me. Um, One of the first things that got recorded for this album was a song called Distance Through Life. And it was a song that I had also recorded for that Another Dead Sharon Noise album on their album Paul. But I did a version on Jeremy's Wonderland. And as I was doing these reissues, I said, what if I could get my hands on that original Distance Through Life from the album Paul? And I remember recording it in our dark Atlanta living room, feeling so full of like that youthful, heavy weight and angst, just singing my heart out to this noise track. And I contacted Aaron Davis and Josh and Greg, and Aaron found Distance Through Life, the original 1997 version, and sent it to me. So on the Jeremy's Wonderland digital album, you can hear Distance Through Life, the original version recorded in Atlanta, and then the version that I recorded in Josh's parents' house in Fredonia, New York, a few months later for Jeremy's Wonderland. So both versions are there. Another bonus track on the digital of this is when Will died in 2015. I was performing the song Too Much Love with Kathy Sings for You at some coffee houses, and we had a live recording of the version we did in 2015. So I thought it was such a special, like, postscript to this whole journey is to have the version that I sang in 2015. I remember playing Will, the album version of this in 1997, and he just looked at me and said, I don't deserve this. So he did. He deserved it. It was a he deserved all the love and more. So anyway, Jeremy's Wonderland, all these punk shows, all these house shows, uh, we really cultivated just a beautiful DIY artistic community in my hometown that summer of 1997. I mean, there were house shows with 50, 60 people, and I was just playing these songs, singing my heart out, and it was just so special. But then the weather started to get colder, and I think some of that trauma and some of that really disappointment that from my move to Atlanta really started to sink in once the winter came. And I just remember I kept giving away the things I owned. TMI, but I think I even gave away my underwear at one point. I'm like, I don't even need boxers anymore. But I just had like a mattress in a room. I don't even think I owned a lamp at the time. I just had a candle. So I started writing these songs and really, really feeling suicidal at this point. I remember just sitting in the bathroom mirror, running a knife over my face, and just like, I just wanted to cut myself. But I guess my optimist, hopeful side always won out. But if any time the darkness rose to the surface of my life, it was when I was writing my album Autumn during the autumn and winter of 1997. Uh, it was during this album where I discovered kind of a lower range in my voice, and these songs are just so freaking sad. Uh, it was artistically rewarding because I was finding a lot of different sounds and textures that I'd never used before. And this album really did kind of get a cult status. This guy, Robert, it was the first thing that ever got reissued of mine on CD, and he did cut off one of the interludes in half. So during this reissue campaign, I've restored the Ready to Dance interlude is now the complete version that was originally cut off on the CD. So everything is there. This is a this is a this is a heavy one. So autumn. Then the spring came, and I was writing these songs on acoustic guitar. I remember cracking open my window, letting the air in, and I bought a lamp for my room. I bought a lamp, and this is the lamp. The album was called Jeremy Gloff because I felt like all I had left of myself was me in this lamp. And then there was a fan, which is on the back cover of the album. All I had was a lamp, a fan, and my mattress. And I had a few things still in storage in my parents' attic. But in my hometown, there's a studio called Tarbox Road Studios, which is where the Flaming Lips record, or at least recorded back in the day. And I had a friend that worked there that offered me a really good deal on studio time. So this self-titled Jeremy Gloff album from 1998 was the first album that I ever recorded in a real studio because everything else was done at home on 4 tracks, completely DIY. So this was an interesting album because it was recorded in a real studio. And another thing that I wanted to try differently is there was a music college in my hometown. I thought, let me ask some of my friends that are music college students to be on this album. So there were some cameos of my friends who were more classically trained musicians. Um, the album's mostly just an acoustic album. Uh, I was still very suicidal, maybe even more so than Autumn. Like, I certainly was not happier during this album, but I think I was just less isolated because there wasn't the snow anymore. I could get out and walk around the the town. I remember one time I was walking through my hometown like at 2 in the morning during that spring. I just picked up a payphone. That's when there was payphones, and I just said, "God, please save me. I'm gonna die if you don't save me." I'm not even a religious person, but I just hoped that something or someone could hear me. So after that summer, I had some friends that were I was supposed to move to San Francisco. The people I was gonna move with I fell out of touch with them, and I just knew I couldn't stay in my hometown. So I had some friends that were moving to Tampa, Florida, and this my friend Heather, she had an apartment. There was a third bedroom. She said, "Do you want that bedroom? We're getting the apartment in September, but I'm moving in July." So she pulled the U-Haul up to my apartment. She opened the back. She said, "Are you putting your stuff in there or not?" I had my box of Nancy Drew books, my CDs, the lamp, and the fan. And I just remember sitting there thinking I can either put the stuff in the U-Haul, send it to Florida, and go down there in September, or I can stay here and probably die. So I took the chance. I carried the box onto the U-Haul. I put it in there. Heather moved it into that apartment in 1998. And here we are in 2025. And I still live in the same apartment. I'm still in the same apartment that I moved in 1998 that saved my life. So that is the end of part one of my reissues. The Jeremy Gloff album didn't have any bonus tracks. It was reissued though with the volume a little bit louder because the original mix was a little bit too quiet. So these early albums, they're so DIY, they're so rough, but they are my heart and they are the first phase of my creative life. So I hope you guys enjoy listening to them, and I look forward to sharing part two with you, which is 2000 through 2015. Coming soon. Love y'all.